Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this Keystone Symposia ePanel discussion on the impacts of climate change and human health. I'm Thale Jarvis, Chief Scientific Officer at Keystone Symposia, and I'd like to welcome you to this event. Keystone Symposia has a long history of programming outstanding events in the life sciences, largely focusing on the underlying molecular and cellular mechanisms that drive fundamental biological processes involved in health and disease. This ePanel is a collaborative initiative with the Global Consortium on Climate and Health Education. This is part of a series of virtual events focused on specific aspects of climate and health, and arises from a broad recognition that climate change is a growing contributor to a variety of health-related concerns, from air quality and respiratory health to infectious disease and heat stress. We also recognize that these health impacts fall unequally across various populations, raising concerns about health equity and the need to build resiliency in our healthcare systems to address systemic inequities arising from climate change. This ePanel series is part of a larger initiative at Keystone Symposia to lower our carbon footprint and democratize access to compelling scientific content through an expanding offering of virtual content. With that, I'd like to welcome Cecilia Sorensen, the Director of the Global Consortium on Climate and Health Education.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. We are delighted that you are joining us here today for this ePanel series on climate change and health. My name is Cecilia Sorensen, and I am the Director of the Global Consortium on Climate and Health Education. Our mission is to ensure that 100% of health professionals globally have the knowledge and skills to prepare for and respond to the climate and health crisis, as we know that impacts are already happening and affecting the most vulnerable patients and communities globally. The GCCHE was founded in 2017 at the Conference of Parties in Paris, and today has grown into a vibrant community of over 300 health professional schools from 50 different countries, all who have pledged to train their students in climate and planetary health. We represent schools of nursing, medicine, pharmacy, public health, social work, dentistry, and veterinary medicine. We are so delighted to be partnering with the Keystone Symposia to bring you this ePanel series on climate change and health, where we bring together experts from around the world to tackle some of the most pressing challenges of our time. Together, our communities have the opportunity to bridge the gap between scientific research and clinical and public health practice, to bring to the forefront collaborations and solutions where they are needed most. So we hope you will join us for the networking session after this event as we continue to build this exciting partnership. Additionally, we invite you to explore our masterclass series, where leading experts in climate and environmental health discuss emerging research and the scientific basis for this work. So thank you for joining us today. We hope you will enjoy this discussion and look forward to working with you.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be joining us from. I am absolutely pleased to be here to host this innovative panel. My name is Dr. Jeremy Hoffman, and I'm the David and Jane Cohn Scientist at the Science Museum of Virginia in Richmond, Virginia, United States. As many of you know, heat waves, such as those experienced around the world during the past few summers, are increasing in frequency, their duration, as well as their intensity due to human-caused climate change, as well as patterns of urbanization. These heat events have clearly been linked to exacerbations in chronic illnesses, cardiovascular disease, respiratory illness, mental health, renal disease, as well as accidental, non-accidental trauma, as well as prenatal birth rates. As such, communities and governments around the world are preparing for the increased stressors and threats of today, as well as seeking to understand the mounting challenges of tomorrow. Seeking to both mitigate the threat of extreme heat, as well as better prioritize how we manage our response to the acute shocks of heat waves, especially in high population cities with limited resources for adaptation actions. So today, we have brought together a panel of leading scientists and practitioners, sometimes they overlap on both, who have worked to advance our understanding of the impacts of extreme heat on individuals, as well as individual neighborhoods and entire communities to address several important questions about heat threats, strategies for mitigating the stressor of extreme heat, and seeking to better understand solutions in our management of the acute stress of heat shocks across various different social contexts. Now, take a second to introduce our panel, and then you will see a series of short videos explaining many of our experts' backgrounds and current projects with regards to extreme heat. As I mentioned, I'm Dr. Jeremy Hoffman from the Science Museum of Virginia, and I'm joined by Dr. Vivek Chandas, who is a professor of climate adaptation and the director of the Sustaining Urban Places Research Lab at the Portland State University. Also joining us is Dr. Rupa Basu, who is Chief of Air and Climate Epidemiology at the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment at the California Environmental Protection Agency. Also joining us is Dr. Dilip Mavalankar, who's the director of the Indian Institute of Public Health, as well as vice president of the Western Region of Public Health Foundation, India. Finally, we are joined also by Kate Mingoya, who is the director of capacity building at Groundworks USA here in the United States. And I'm also, not to forget, our colleague, Dr. Jeremy Hess, who is also a professor of environmental and occupational health sciences at the University of Washington. So with that, we are going to begin by going through a short 5-minute background presentations from all of our panelists, as well as myself, and come back where then I will facilitate a group discussion of the questions that we have prepared for you, as well as then a audience question and answer period. So sit back, relax, and enjoy our short presentations for now. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dr. Jeremy Hoffman, and I'm the David and Jane Cohn Scientist at the Science Museum of Virginia. I've spent the last several years working at the interface of science and society as an informal educator and researcher at a science and technology center here in Richmond, Virginia. The questions I've asked have dealt with several science-relevant questions that the public engages with, but none has been more important than my work on how and why people use scientific information to move from awareness to action, especially when it comes to climate change. As you know, global climate change is brought on by the gradual accumulation of heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere brought on by human activities like burning fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas. And this has led to a sharp rise in global surface temperature, such that you'd have to be over 34 years old to have lived on a planet the last time global average temperatures for a given month were below the 20th century average. Global climate change expresses itself in many different ways depending on the local context, but largely you can take those impacts and say that we're already experiencing and continue to expect a hotter, wetter, sneezier, and wheezier climate. And ultimately, the level of global warming reached will scale alongside the intensity of these stressors and their attendant increases as well. We're going to talk a lot about hotter today, but quickly wetter in the sense that sea levels are going up globally and can be exacerbated by local sorts of overprints, causing coastal areas to be under severe risk of increased flooding, as well as precipitation events around the world largely becoming wetter in the sense of being more intense and shorter in duration. Those same patterns can be thought of in the opposite direction, whereby places that are already experiencing dry conditions may continue to have more severe and flashy drought conditions in the future. Sneezier and wheezier climate are brought on by long-term increases in the pollen season, intensifying those, as well as CO2 fertilization. And a wheezier climate in the sense of wildfire smoke finding its way into new places, even from far away fires. Now let's concentrate on hotter. Now, climate change, of course, loads the weather dice for more extreme events. Now, in this case, with heat, we've seen across many different countries that this relates to longer, stronger heat waves, as well as being more frequent in their occurrence and happening at weirder times of the year, which can have more devastating health-related effects if occurring at a time when they are largely haven't been acclimatized to by those people living in that particular area. Now, that's with global climate change going on, but we also know that particular places were already hotter than some others to begin with, and this is largely due to a well-understood phenomenon known as the urban heat island effect, whereby human-built surfaces have very low albedo or reflectivity, and so they absorb more of the sun's energy throughout the afternoon and then re-emit it back into the air as heat in the afternoon as well as into the evening. And this elevates surface and air temperatures in urban areas relative to their outlying suburban and rural areas. But we've learned that even within cities, depending on the balance of a variety of different variables, such as the geometry, heat from human activities, as well as the type of building materials, and then the more nature-based aspects of a neighborhood like water and vegetation can have a very large local effect on the nearby temperatures. So you can think of this as global climate change adds an additional level of background warming to an already inequitable heat distribution within human civilizations. Now, we also know that these heat events disproportionately affect individuals that are living in hotter areas, as well as those with chronic illnesses, the elderly, the extremely young, and many other lower socioeconomic groups that have lack of adaptive capacity or the resources necessary to adapt to those acute stressors. Here in the United States, our work has been able to show that these patterns are related to long-term planning decisions that were made almost a century ago here in the United States, and this is connected to a policy known as redlining that played out in the 1930s and 40s. And knowing that there's this background of marginalization, racism, and classism underpinning these patterns of extreme heat, as well as access to resources, the appropriate solutions, as you'll learn about today from this absolutely illustrious group of scientists and practitioners, that these solutions to extreme heat in our cities, as well as many of those other climate-related stressors that I mentioned, will seek to both mitigate or reduce that stressor while also managing that acute stressor and the risks associated with heat through governance structures. And so I'm very excited to share with you the expertise of these individuals today, and sit back, relax, and enjoy our panel.
Greetings. I'm Dr. Jeremy Hess. I'm a professor of emergency medicine, environmental and occupational health sciences, and global health at the University of Washington. I'm also the director of our Center for Health and the Global Environment. I'm very pleased to be talking with you today about heat-related illness and death. Humans are what we call euthermic, which means we maintain our temperatures within a very narrow physiologic range. As you can see here, over the course of a 24-hour day, we tend to keep our temperatures within the bounds of roughly 97 to 99.5 degrees Fahrenheit. We maintain this euthermia through a number of different mechanisms, some of which are physiologic, some of which are behavioral. But maintaining a core body temperature within a narrow range is very important to us physiologically for the functioning of all sorts of different physiologic processes. Because of this, when we're exposed to environments that are outside of our comfort range, we tend to have adverse health impacts. And we can see this when we look at mortality curves associated with temperature. You can see here for northern cities, the solid lines, that there's a minimum mortality temperature roughly around 70 degrees Fahrenheit. For southern cities, that temperature is a little higher, close to 80 degrees. Below the minimum mortality temperature, mortality rises. It also rises a bit more steeply above the minimum mortality temperature. We see signs of acclimatization in the difference between the two curves, We also see that the minimum mortality temperature shifts to the right over the course of a summer, regardless of location. Heat stress affects lots of different organs in our bodies. One of the main shifts that occurs is we shunt blood from the core out to the periphery in order to convey heat to the surface of our bodies and our skin, and to facilitate cooling by sweating. Now, this strains our hearts. It also, to some degree, strains our lungs and our kidneys. So people who have chronic diseases that affect any of those organs may struggle to respond appropriately to excess heat exposure. When people get too hot, they experience a range of acute heat illnesses. The most mild of these illnesses is heat exhaustion, where people feel faint or dizzy, but they're able to maintain their core temperature within the appropriate range. They may be nauseated, they may feel weak, but if they relax and get away from the external source of heat and stop producing heat internally through exercise or other effort, they'll recover. Heat stroke, on the other hand, is a more serious form of heat illness. People with heat stroke often have throbbing headaches, they've stopped sweating, they're no longer maintaining their body temperature in the appropriate range. And in fact, their temperatures are always high. They may be nauseated, they may be vomiting, and they are always altered, meaning they may be confused or even comatose. Treating acute heat illness requires removal from the heat source, stopping all physical activities, and cooling. For heat exhaustion, as I mentioned, people will recover if they are immediately treated. For heat stroke, rapid, aggressive cooling is required. Usually this is through external means, putting ice packs in the neck and the armpits and the groin to contact with large blood vessels and cool people rapidly. We sometimes also immerse them in ice water baths. People with heat stroke have a very high mortality rate, between 10 and 25%, depending on how quickly and aggressively they're treated. And they are critically ill. If they survive their illnesses, they need to be admitted to an ICU and monitored for complications related to this dangerous syndrome. Because the climate is warming, we're seeing much more extreme heat. We've seen roughly 1.2 degrees Celsius of warming to date. And as a result, 10-year extreme heat events or heat waves, so extreme heat events that would have occurred once every 10 years in the historical climate, are now 2.8 times more likely, exposing a lot more people to extreme heat much more frequently. In the future, we can expect that this trend will continue to increase. And with 2 degrees Celsius of warming, we'll see roughly doubling of this increase. So we'll see 10-year events return roughly 5.6 times more often. This is even more dramatic for the more rare 50-year event, which is now occurring about just under 5 times as often as it did in the historical climate. And with 2 degrees of warming, which we're likely to see within the next 20 years, we will see extreme heat events occur about 14 times more often than they did. We're already seeing impacts. Here are some figures showing a significant and global increase in the frequency of heat attributable deaths, which are driven by climate change. We can see this is impacting countries the world over and is only one of several climate change impacts that are significant challenges to global health equity. We're also seeing it here in the United States, where redlining and other historically racist policies have led to significantly increased heat exposure in Black and low-income neighborhoods around the country. This inequity is only expected to worsen as the climate warms. You can see here this work compiled by the EPA last year shows that Black and African American neighborhoods are much more highly exposed to extreme heat with 2 degrees of warming, and with 4 degrees of warming, this inequity between Blacks and other groups increases even more dramatically. There are thankfully several interventions we can put forth to reduce people's risks. At an individual level, there are a number of sustainable interventions, including fans and dousing, foot immersion and wet clothing, frozen towels and t-shirts, and other strategies to keep people cool without significant expense or carbon emissions. At the system level, we need to develop interventions like changes in the built environment and cooling centers, cooling strategies for communal living situations, climate resilient health systems, all in order to address the increasing risk. There are also, importantly, population level interventions. Heat early warning systems are an important mechanism for reducing risk. Those early warning systems include identifying temperature thresholds, coupling those thresholds to forecasts in order to know when to pull the trigger on warnings, disseminating those warnings to the public through effective communication, and linking warnings with a wide range of effective interventions to reduce risk at the individual and collective level. My colleagues are going to be talking about all of these themes and ways we can protect people and reduce the inequities in extreme heat exposure. I want to leave you with these points. Humans maintain their temperatures in a very narrow range, and excess heat stresses body systems, can lead to illness, and severe heat illness can be fatal. Diagnosis of acute heat illness is clinical, and rapid cooling is essential. Climate change, of course, is worsening exposure, and this is driving increased inequities in climate change health impacts globally and locally. Heat illness is preventable, however, so we need to do everything we can to protect individuals, communities, and our systems in order to prepare and more appropriately and effectively reduce risk in the changing climate. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for the introduction and for the invitation to be on this panel today. I will be presenting epidemiologic studies of ambient heat exposure and health impacts in the next few slides. As heat waves increase in duration, frequency, and intensity, we are seeing record numbers of deaths and illnesses throughout the world, ranging from hundreds to thousands, just from one heat wave alone. These numbers reported in the news, however, are very underreported and only represent the tip of the iceberg. Heat-related deaths are severely underreported. This is partly because there is no standard definition for a heat wave and no systematic way to diagnose heat-related deaths or illnesses in the US. That's why they are often not reported as underlying cause of death or illness unless there is no other cause of death or illness suspected following a heat wave, which results in a surveillance bias. This demonstrates the importance of looking at health outcomes other than only the classic heat-related ones to capture the actual impact on health impacts. It is also important to consider local levels of exposure for heat alerts, especially in high-risk communities, rather than larger geographic areas, such as at the county level. And what we've found is that heat really affects nearly all organs in the body. So, of course, there's the classic heat-related illness and dehydration that we often see during heat waves or even during higher ambient heat exposure. Cardiovascular mortality and morbidity are huge outcomes, specifically heart attacks or congestive heart failure. And mental health is an area that we've recently explored and is really starting to pick up a lot of studies how heat and just temperature in general affects mental health, suicides, homicides, as well as some specific categories of mental health outcomes. Adverse birth outcomes, which I will talk about a little bit more, include preterm delivery, stillbirth, low birth weight. We've seen some connections with liver and kidney disease, gastrointestinal diseases, respiratory diseases, which we have to be careful because sometimes these are confounded by air pollutants, as well as links with diabetes. Populations at risk for heat-related deaths and illnesses include elderly, pregnant women, infants and young children, outdoor workers, those living alone in higher apartment or condominiums buildings, socially isolated populations, and young athletes. Also, we've recently looked into the literature of temperature and mental health and found that there are certain medications such as antidepressants that actually affect heat-related, that increase heat-related deaths and illnesses, as well as beta blockers that are used for heart disease. Also, a huge effect modifier of this association is poverty. And there's different ways that poverty is measured. It could be socioeconomic status. Sometimes we use race or ethnic group. Then if we have, income levels or other markers for socioeconomic status or poverty, we often use those. There are many reasons for disparities in health effects from heat. First, there are lasting effects of redlining, which have historically placed higher risk communities in hotter areas with more absorption and retention of heat, with more roads, blacktop areas, buildings, and generally less green space. This is known as the urban heat island effect. There are also higher levels of air pollution, as these same areas are often closer to freeways and sources of fossil fuel combustion. Structural racism and socioeconomic inequities may also lead to chronic stress and fewer resources to reduce exposures such as affording the cost of air conditioners, relocating if necessary, or not working outdoors during the hottest times of the day. Furthermore, there are inequities in access, quality, and affordability in healthcare from a lack of diversity in healthcare providers. So people may not feel trusted or listened to if nobody in the room looks like them in terms of gender or race. Even with the same access to healthcare, there could be issues with differential treatment. So the last slide I'd like to leave you with is that climate change has many different mechanisms. It's multifactorial. For example, heat could relate to drought, which could relate to wildfires, which eventually leads to migration and displacement. Thank you so much for your attention. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me at the email address listed here. Thanks.
Hello, my name is Vivek Shandis. I'm a professor of geography at Portland State University, and I've been working on issues of urban heat for the larger portion of the last 20 years. Heat's a very expensive public health challenge that communities are dealing with on a rapidly accelerating rate at this point when the entire globe is seeing temperatures increase and heat waves really accelerate. What makes heat so expensive is that we've created a landscape that amplifies temperatures, which leads to a lot of medical impacts, including fatalities, as well as increase in energy costs for communities and a lot of behavioral shifts, which increases crime in particular areas. There's very limited evidence that public health practitioners have to go on to be able to actually build systems that are responsive to heat. And we saw this firsthand when the heat dome affected the Pacific Northwest in 2021. And this led to a large number of fatalities and emergency room visits, as noted on this graph. We saw more deaths during this heat wave, and one of the first climate-induced deaths that occurred in the Pacific Northwest in May and in June of last year. And we saw that play out in very predictable ways, very similar to the 1995 heat wave that affected Chicago. We saw communities that had limited coping capacity, as well as those areas that were the hottest parts of the city, shown here on a map on the left, where red is the hottest areas, blue are the coolest areas. And the map on the right, which showed darker colors, are places where larger numbers of people died. There was a high correlation between the temperatures that we saw and the places that people died. And we've known that for some time. So what can we do about it? A large part of what we're trying to do is build community awareness. There are a number of other analyses that can happen in terms of social vulnerability, assessing the physical landscape, behavioral responses, including infrastructure upgrades that might be considered as well. Though I want to focus here on just one aspect of community awareness. After that intense heat dome that descended on the Pacific Northwest in 2021, we created an event that was called Heatweek. You can go to heatweek.org to look at this. And we worked with local practitioners, public health practitioners, as well as emergency management practitioners to commemorate those who died during the heat event 1 year ago, as well as to prepare communities for taking advantage of resources that are available in multiple languages to be able to engage communities. We had events that ranged from mental health and heat and climate to bike rides to first aid training, as well as a reflection on what is it that we could do to better prepare our region for the extreme heat that we're seeing more frequently and more intense episodes around. And so this really got us thinking about what else we could do. And part of this also leads to a series of heat campaigns that we've been running, where we engage local organizations and provide them with equipment to go out and measure temperatures in and around a region, so we can get very granular descriptions of how one part of a city or one part of a region differs in terms of temperatures to another part, since we've seen that as an important covariate for the mortalities that we've seen in different parts of the country. And this allows us to be able to expand and scale the co-production of knowledge of heat with community groups and in a research capacity. This year, we've undertaken over 15 of these campaigns, both in the United States as well as Sierra Leone, in Africa and Brazil and South America. And these have all led to rapid acceleration of awareness building, as well as our ability to really move forward on specific interventions that can happen in areas around each city. Now, this has been evidenced by a number of different climate action plans that have been incorporating our heat maps, as well as events that are able to bring more awareness, and then specific strategies, interventions that would engage hospitals, engage public health practitioners, and engage communities at large to be able to go out and identify potential ways to reduce health-related impacts from extreme heat. So that's my little time that I have with you today. Looking forward to our conversation about how we can center historically impacted communities, as well as the ways in which interventions can improve the response actions that can be taken in a specific location. So thank you, and I look forward to the conversation.
Welcome. I'm Dilip Mavadanka, Director, Indian Institute of Public Health, Gandhinagar. I'll be talking about heat action planning in India with an example of the city of Ahmedabad. Many parts of India reach 110 degrees upwards in the summer. Ahmedabad had a major heat wave in 2010. The temperatures went up to 47 degrees on 21st of May. During this heat wave, the daily all-cause mortality, which normally is at about 100 given the 5 million population, rose on 21st of May to 310, and the following week it gradually decreased. This excess mortality in 1 week in Ahmedabad 2010 heat wave was 800, which is depicted in this graph. The graph shows a scatter plot of maximum temperature and daily all-cause deaths. This was used to set thresholds for alert in Ahmedabad city. Using the mortality and temperature analysis, we helped develop the first heat action plan in Ahmedabad city in 2013. This was first such heat action plan in South Asian cities. Heat action plan has 4 major interventions or components: early warning system and interagency response plan, public awareness and community outreach, capacity building of medical professionals, and reducing heat exposure and promoting adaptive measures. This slide shows the early warning system and interagency response plan. The India Meteorology Department, which is the Weather Service of India, provides 5-day early warning of the temperatures and the alert level during the summer. This information is received by the nodal officer of the health department, and he then alerts various departments and the public depending upon the level of alert: yellow alert, orange alert, and red alert. This slide shows various activities carried out for public awareness and community outreach. Many meetings, seminars, workshops were held with people who were highly exposed to heat. There were also a lot of posters, hoardings, and electronic boards put for alerting people during the heat summer season in the city. The third component of the heat action plan was building capacity of the medical community. We organized several workshops and meetings of doctors and health workers to make them aware of the heat-related dangers and how to manage heat-related illnesses. The fourth component of the heat-related action plan is reducing heat exposure. This meant developing cooling centers, keeping parks and gardens open for longer time, free distribution of water, and many other measures. One of the measures added later on in the heat action plan was cool roofing or reflective roofing. Many vulnerable communities were encouraged to put white color paint on the roof to reduce heat exposure. These photographs show a slum dweller putting white color roof on the house. The evaluation of the heat action plan showed that each year roughly 1,200 deaths were prevented after implementation of the heat action plan. This slide shows that the recorded heat stroke deaths and cases have gone down in 2014-15 onwards after implementation of the heat action plan as compared to 2010. This slide shows that the relative risk of mortality has gone down substantially after the implementation of the heat action plan in Ahmedabad city. Following the example of Ahmedabad in development of heat action plan and its impact, many cities in India have now developed such plans, and the National Disaster Management Authority has taken it as a model plan to replicate throughout the country. Before I end, I want to thank all our partners: Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation, NRDC, CDKN, University of Washington, Mount Sinai School of Medicine, India Meteorology Department, and 108 Emergency Service. All of them actively helped in implementing and evaluating this program. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Kate Nagoya-LaFortune. I'm the National Director of Climate Resilience and Land Use at Groundwork USA, and I'm excited to be here with you folks today. Before we get started, I wanted to show you this aerial image and ask if you were hanging out on a hot July or August day, where would you like to be hanging out? If you're anything like me, you probably want to be on the left-hand side of the dotted line. There is a dense and lush and mature tree canopy cover that is casting plenty of shade to read a book under. There is some grass that is green, and a swimming pool on the lower left-hand side looks really pleasant. But on the other side of that dotted line, which I can't emphasize enough to you is on the same block, the picture looks a lot different. There is a scraggly, dry, and desiccated tree canopy cover, tons of blacktop like parking lots and roads that are going to absorb the sun's heat and radiate it back out, contributing to the urban heat island effect. And there's a lot of impermeable pavement, which means when the rain falls, it's not going to have anywhere to go, and it's going to contribute to flooding a lot more on the right-hand side than it is on the left-hand side. This picture is of the Lower Price Hill neighborhood in Cincinnati, Ohio, but it's a picture that we can see in pretty much any state, and you might be familiar with an image like this from your own community. As I mentioned, I work with Groundwork USA, which is the national support organization for more than 20 people-centered environmental justice organizations from coast to coast, all the way from San Diego to Indianapolis to Elizabeth, New Jersey. Check out our website, groundworkusa.org, and see if there's a trust near you. Our work is to put residents in the driver's seat and making changes to their built environment. That's everything from acting as the urban forester for a community and helping to densify its tree canopy cover, to taking over contaminated parcels of land and turning them into community assets like parks. And also, over the last 5 years or so, in response to community need, we've been working more and more on climate mitigation. People are struggling from extreme heat and extreme precipitation and are wondering what's next. So you may have looked at that picture of the Lower Price Hill neighborhood in Cincinnati, Ohio, and thought to yourself, Kate, I got it. We just need to plant things. We need to get green stuff in the ground. And the answer to that is like, yeah, we should absolutely do that. Please, if you see a place like that in your community, get the community together, lobby your municipality, and get them to plant some trees. But that's not the only thing we should be thinking of, because this kind of green infrastructure does have some limits and it takes a while to be effective. For example, this tree is planted outside of my home in Somerville, Massachusetts, and you can see that it's going to be really cool in about 30 years, but right now it's casting a shadow the size and shape of a pizza box. Additionally, because of those low-hanging power lines, this is a dwarf varietal, because if it were to grow up to the level of the power lines, the utility company can and would cut it down. What we should be doing, in addition to planting those trees, is asking, why has change not yet come about? Why do our neighborhoods look the way that they do? And that's part of what we do in our Climate Safe Neighborhoods Partnership, which is a 16-city partnership to understand the relationship between historical race-based housing discrimination and modern-day environmental justice issues like extreme heat and flooding. And we believe in a two-pronged approach. The first is acknowledging that our communities don't look the way that they do by accident. There's a long history that makes that area of Cincinnati look the way that it does. And it's important for us to work with residents to intervene in those systems to get a more equitable distribution of resources to keep people safe from the climate crisis. But at the same time, people are really struggling this very minute. So it's important for us to do things like getting these small 1% infrastructure pieces into the ground, like planting trees, bioswales, rain gardens, removing blacktop, doing white roof painting to help keep people safe from extreme heat and precipitation now. Our Climate Safe Neighborhoods Partnership works to build resident capacity through a 3-year process. The first is we use a lot of maps, including geospatial images from Landsat data and historical redlining maps to understand who's impacted. Why do our neighborhoods look the way that they do? The second year, we work closely with residents to understand their priorities. What would they like to see change in their neighborhood to help keep them safe from extreme heat and precipitation? And then we build resident capacity to be able to organize and self-advocate the municipality for a more equitable distribution of resources. You might say to yourself, like, that's a cool story. Looking forward during the Q&A to hearing more, but what can I, a person who's at the grassroots level, do, who's not paid to do this work? Or maybe I'm at the grass tops and I'm not really sure how to use my skills or my access and my resources to contribute. The first thing you got to do is to remember that there's no panacea, no 100% solution that's going to fix everything. At best, we can put together 101% solutions. We really need to lean into that. The first thing that you can do is to rethink who you consider to be the experts. You can never replace the knowledge that residents have on the ground when you're trying to understand how to make that space and place better. That means paying residents for their time, and that means taking their expertise and understanding of their community as seriously as you would a hydrologist or an urban planner or someone who has a quote unquote more formalized type of education or on subject matter. The second piece is to evaluate the resources that you have. Do you have time? Do you have money to throw at the problem? Do you have physical strength to help pull up pavement in your community? Or do you have the curiosity and persistence to understand how systems work and lend your help to other people who are doing that work? It's important for you to find people who are doing this work out in the community, low-income neighborhoods, neighborhoods of color, places that are most vulnerable to extreme heat and precipitation, often do have nonprofits or community groups or just concerned residents who are doing this work. Find them and support them. Also lean into these 1% solutions. This is more around flooding than it is heat. I know this panel's on heat, but I could never pass up showing this picture on the left, which is on the walk from my home to my daughter's daycare. This is a catch basin, so water is supposed to flow in there into the sewer system. There are small solutions that you can do in your community, like grabbing a stick and just poking all that dirt out. Some cities will have adopt a catch basin programs like the one on the right that asks residents to clear out debris so that flooding doesn't happen in the community. You can also check out paving parties, where if there's extra blacktop, say a backyard that's paved over, or a business doesn't need all of the parking space that it has, the landlord or the person who owns the property will just buy a dumpster permit and some pizzas, and residents from the community will show up with crowbars and shovels and pickaxes, and then pull up all of that extra pavement and then replace it with a garden. This is from a couple months ago in my neighborhood. And then finally, it's important that you mess up the system by identifying who is not in the room when decisions are being made and doing what you can to get those people into the room. And part of that means prioritizing with people-centered organizations that truly engage in shared leadership and decision-making with those who are most vulnerable. The people who are on the ground experiencing extreme heat are the ones that know what they need. I'm looking forward to chatting more during the Q&A. In the meantime, check out our website, groundworkusa.org, or hit me up on email. Looking forward to the conversation.
Welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much for listening to these short presentations. As you can see, we have a variety of different perspectives around this digital table today, offering a wide variety of contexts and applications of work related to extreme heat. Now, what we're going to do now is to go through some discussion topics. I will lead and ask for particular perspectives, but largely these will be left open to the rest of the panel. Meanwhile, I believe you have seen Shannon has been putting in the chat a link for you to offer your own questions as audience members, which then you can vote, physically upvote them, so that when we get to the question and answer, we get straight to the ones that are found the most interesting by the rest of the audience. So without any further ado, I think that this is a really important first question up front for our kind of heat and health researcher folks, Dr. Hess, Dr. Basu, and then the rest of you, is like, what are some of the most, we learned so much about how extreme heat interacts with individual level health, as well as kind of more community and population health. I'm curious, from your perspectives, what are the most important, outstanding, or unresolved questions that are related to individual health and heat extremes, heat stress? And Dr. Hess, Dr. Basu, whoever would like to go first.
Well, I'm happy to start. From my point of view, I think some of the most important questions actually have to do with how to effectively and efficiently identify people who are at risk, and then how to deploy appropriate interventions to reduce their risks. And so I think about those interventions being behavioral interventions, like where you sit down, you identify a patient who may be at risk, you sit down and you have 2 minutes to talk about how to reduce their heat risk and help them understand when they actually are experiencing adverse health impacts from heat exposure, and how, very importantly, to link that risk identification and intervention up with other kinds of interventions at a larger scale, at a neighborhood scale, at a city scale, et cetera, that you heard other panelists talking about during these previous sessions, to help reduce risk over the long term and at a community scale. So identifying people quickly and efficiently, developing interventions and testing them that to determine that they actually work, because we don't know that about most of our interventions right now, and then figuring out how to match that up with larger scale community-wide interventions to reduce risk over time.
Thank you, Dr. Hess. Dr. Basu, does that resonate with your experience and perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to add that, so all of the epi studies that we've conducted so far are population based, so large population scaled, and it's really important for identifying vulnerable subgroups. So there's heat health effects for really everybody, and then we're just trying to look at vulnerable subgroups. But then let's take it a step further and talk about the individual risk. The way that we could do that, we know that heat is the #1 killer of all climate change exposure. So it's really important to figure out what is that biological mechanism that's happening to really prevent a lot of these heat-related deaths and illnesses. So there have been some personal exposure assessments done already, looking at ambient and also core body temperature, and then to kind of link those with the biological mechanisms, like what is happening to the heart. Do things happen differently with medication use, or being outdoors or indoors? What is better? So just trying to figure out that for individuals, especially in high-risk communities, versus keeping it at this high level, population level, is where I think we need to move next.
Thank you. Any other panelists have a particular perspective on this question of some outstanding or unresolved questions, would like to offer their perspective?
I might quickly add to this by suggesting that something I've been working on for a long time is, not being a medical doctor myself, the recognition that when a medical doctor is seeing a patient, that the location matters so much of where that person lives in relation to many of these exposures. And so as a spatial socio urban ecologist, I tend to think about how that particular place that a patient is coming in from might be really exposing them to greater levels of harm. And many of these studies that we touched on today really recognize that importance of zip code, that importance of location, and the distributional effects that climate has. So might just offer that as a way to enrich the conversation with patients, especially as I notice many people are clinicians in this discussion.
Yeah, and that conversation, that one-to-one connection with potential through the healthcare system, to have that kind of undergird the approach towards education around the steps that individuals can take. That's a hugely important aspect of this as well. Anyone else on the panel? Kate, Dr. Mavalankar?
Yeah.
Well, speaking to that, though, I guess this question is mostly directed at Dr. Mavalankar. Is you spoke in your presentation about how excess deaths were really exorbitantly overrepresented during the heat event back in May 2010. And I'm curious, could you give us a quick overview of how we report these heat-related impacts of extreme heat? What are some caveats about how these data are tabulated? And then how do these practices differ across the world?
Yeah. So I think this is an important point, that, as Dr. Basu also mentioned, that the definition of heat-related deaths varies substantially. And it is in some sense not really a direct definition. Physicians have to eliminate other causes of mortality and also associate with an ongoing heat wave or a heat event, and also look at the comorbidities, because what we see is that what is called as exertional heat stroke or direct heat stroke, they're only about 10% of the cases, whereas the rest, which are non-exertional, which happens in comorbid old people or newborns, is almost 90%. And that is where most of those get missed. The direct heat stroke, the person is working in very hot sunlight, he has classical symptoms of heat stroke and is easily picked up. But the indirect ones or non-exertional ones are the ones which are missed. Secondly, this is in some sense known to the medical profession in India, but they have forgotten it. Because so far everybody thought that India is very hot, everybody is used to heat. Of course, some people do report dead, one or two every summer. But when we did our analysis and realized that 800 people died just in 1 week, additional deaths in one city, whereas the whole country has been reporting only about 500 to 2000 deaths because of heat stroke. So our whole reporting system needs a very close revamp. And my sense is it's like an iceberg. We pick up the 10%, which is seen easily, miss 90%. And that is where the all cause mortality, daily all cause mortality tabulation and correlation with the daily maximum temperatures is important. The other thing which we realized through our analysis is not only the maximum daily temperature, but also the night temperature highs. So if the day is hot and the night is cool, still mortality remains low because people get time, or bodies get time to cool at night. Because most of the people don't have air conditioning in India. At most, they may have fan. Whereas if the night is hot, which is more than 30 degrees in Ahmedabad, and day is more than 45 degrees, the risk of death almost becomes triple or four times more. So we should also pay uh, heat to the nighttime minimum temperatures and correlate that with the mortality along with the daytime maximum temperatures.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mavlankar. Dr. Hess, Dr. Basu, as U.S.-based practitioners, does this disparity resonate? Do those approaches kind of scale across these applications? And if you could speak to how this is additionally, applied here in the United States.
Well, I'm not a physician, I'm an epidemiologist, so I can speak from that perspective. I think it's really important, in addition to looking at the nighttime temperature and the average temperature, I think it's also really important to note that it's not really extreme heat that we need to see these health effects. From our studies, we're actually seeing just from ambient or apparent temperature, which is temperature and humidity, at the background level, we're already seeing these health effects. It's just that with heat waves or with extreme heat, they get much worse. And so really, everything that I've presented, just think about that's kind of the best case scenario. This is what we're experiencing now. And then with the projections in the future with, increased heat waves and duration and frequency, all of these health impacts are going to be just, substantially greater. I just wanted to point that out.
Oh, thank you very much. And Dr. Hess, being that you're at the University of Washington and Dr. Chandas spoke to the heat dome of last summer, do you want to speak to some patterns that maybe in your clinical experience during that heat wave, what that kind of looked like, and whether that kind of excess approach is the way that you've seen the most significant impact?
Sure. Well, certainly what Dr. Mavlankar spoke to resonated for me. I've worked with him for a long time, and so have a sense of how the health impacts of heat exposure present in India and also here. And actually, there's quite a bit of similarity. That one of the important things for the audience to note is that heat kills people, affects their health generally, and sometimes kills them through a number of different pathways. And some of them are sort of classic acute heat illness pathways that lead to heat stroke. But a lot of times it's actually just flares of chronic disease that end up causing the problem. So if someone has chronic kidney disease, diabetes, heart disease, lung disease, exposure to heat overwhelms them physiologically, and they end up in the emergency department and being admitted to the hospital for that. And so the underlying population health structure of a given community is what determines what kinds of heat illnesses you're going to see. But generally, in most places now, where there are a lot of chronic illnesses or patients with chronic illnesses, we see a lot more patients who have chronic disease exacerbations than we do acute heat illness. So that's important to bear in mind. And that's important when you think about surveillance definitions, which feed into Dr. Basu's work, but they also feed into public health response, that you need a surveillance definition that captures all of these chronic disease exacerbations in response to heat. And you also need a health system that's responsive and able to recognize social determinants of health. Like Dr. Chandas was saying, that we need to be able to recognize that where a patient lives affects their risk, but we also need to be able to act on that. And right now, it's nearly impossible for a practicing clinician to feel like they can do much about that in a given moment. And there are some interesting new lines of research looking at greening abandoned lots, for instance, and a trial that was done recently by another emergency physician that found beneficial impact on community mental health, the mental health of people living adjacent to these lots. So we need more of that information. We need the ability to extend our, the main thing I can do for you in a given context clinically is diagnose you properly and then administer appropriate therapy to you individually. And usually that's medicines, right? We need to be able to also extend that to a community prescription for greener, more equitable living conditions and reduced risk for people who we know are at higher risk because of where they live.
Well, and thank you very much for that. That's those three perspectives I think really paint an important picture of like the kind of data around who is showing up and what are some of the common threads around kind of individuals that are disproportionately susceptible to extreme heat being in these particular places. And so I'd like to invite Kate and Vivek, Dr. Chandas, to reflect a little bit on the history behind these present day patterns of health outcome and especially climate related inequity, and then talk a little bit about how do we do these interventions and what are some considerations that organizations need to be aware of as they try to embark on new heat mitigation or management programs. And either one can go first for sure.
I'll pop in. So I think one of the important things to recognize is our neighborhoods don't look the way that they do by accident, and they're not going to change by accident. A lot of folks have mentioned the relationship between redlining practices, for example. I actually think you can also look back to urban renewal and a bunch of other local and federal government interventions to understand that there have been some pretty big changes to the built environment that have been made over the last 60 years or so. But folks often wonder, they say, hey, redlining was outlawed 54 years ago. What does that have to do with my patient coming in with heat stroke or with respiratory distress? And I think one of the things to understand is that it's not just about the built environment, but it's about the power of those with the least amount of social capital, that neighborhoods that are low income neighborhoods, working class neighborhoods, neighborhoods with a high proportion of people of color are the ones that tend to be the least invested in by municipalities. And part of that might be that residents are not able to contribute a ton to the coffers of their local government if it's a city or town that's relatively low income. But part of it also might be that the folks with the most social capital, political capital, and the loudest voices are ones that tend to get resources distributed towards them, and that historically has been folks that are white, that are higher income. And we see a pretty big relationship, and we have got two of the gentlemen that helped to pioneer that the deep dive into that data here, Jeremy and Vivek, that there's a pretty significant difference in formerly red-lined neighborhoods versus formerly green-lined neighborhoods in how they're experiencing extreme heat and precipitation. And part of that's related to, were parks cited there? And we have to ask ourselves, why were parks cited in some places or not? Sewage infrastructure being updated, certain typologies of housing or industry being allowed near certain folks. So we do need to ask a lot of really deep questions about who are the people that are socially marginalized. Spoiler alert, we know the answer to that question. We just need to sort of face it head on. And what can we do to start to rewrite that harm and repair that harm? We've don't want to just fix the harm, we also want to keep that harm from happening again. So a system change solution is something that's really important. Vivek, any other additions on that?
Yeah, maybe just quickly, when you think about a city, any city that you're living in, places that have been historically disinvested in, meaning that they've been marginalized, meaning that there's either informal developments in those areas and or they just haven't received a lot of services from municipal agencies. Often what happens is those land areas are very depressed or suppressed by the economic machine that runs in most of our urban environments. And as a result, those areas, by definition, will receive all those very land-hungry, large-scale land uses like industrial facilities, like big highways, like large manufacturing centers, big box stores, etc. And as a result, those materials, those often asphalt concrete materials, are very heat hungry. They will absorb the sun's shortwave solar radiation, retain it for a long time, and re-emit it through the evening when we find the majority number of heat-related mortality morbidities. And so that evening exposure within the household that a resident may feel is something we don't really have good data on. We don't actually know what temperatures people are exposed to when their traditional response or a conventional response is to go indoors during a heat wave. We don't know what those indoor temperatures are. So we've embarked on a study, for example, with the city of Portland to set up small little sensors, temperature sensors, in a number of public housing residences around town. And we actually monitored these residences over summer, and we're finding enormous discrepancies, sometimes upwards of 50 degrees Fahrenheit between one resident and another across the same time period. And that is even larger than the differences we've seen in outdoor temperatures. And so this indoor exposure piece is something we're going deep into and trying to get a better sense of it by using empirical data to assess the exposure that folks have in and around these historically disinvested neighborhoods.
Well, thank you both for those perspectives and hearing about really innovative approaches to understanding not only outdoor but indoor and the kind of multi-generational history that leads us up to those current present day inequities and exposure is really important for all of us, not only in the US context, but what that might mean internationally across different governance structures as well. As I saw, there was a lot of folks here from other countries around the world joining us this afternoon or evening or morning, depending on your time zone. Now, this is probably the last question that we'll take from our list of predetermined questions before we get to the audience-based questions, which there are several top candidates here. But this one is kind of a really interesting emerging topic that I've heard of from a variety of different practitioners and researchers. It's a pretty hot topic, and that's not a pun that was fully intended, but nonetheless is still very topical for this conversation, is that there seems to be, and according to Dr. Basu and Dr. Mabalankar's work, Dr. Hess, everyone's work here, is that there's some sort of issues with the way that we communicate the risks of extreme heat in advance of and during those sorts of events. And so one approach that has been suggested is the idea of naming an extreme heat event, much like we do other more discrete forms of extreme weather, like a hurricane. And I'm just kind of curious if all of you, would provide from your own perspective, clinician, epidemiologists, community focused project director, researcher, what would be the kind of pros and cons of this approach from your perspective? And why don't I go? I'll just in the top of my screen here is Dr. Basu. Would you mind just giving your perspective around this topic?
Sure. Yes. So I think by naming heat waves, it really kind of almost catches us up with the other climate change issues like hurricanes, like wildfires. I think that by not naming them, it really kind of belittles them and we kind of look past them like, oh, that was just another heat wave, and we move on. But by naming it, we could go back and refer to them. We could, many times in terms of epi studies, we don't get the data until a lot later in terms of mortality. So let's say we want to do an epi study and we don't get the data until a few months later. Well, we can go back and refer to it instead of just saying the California heat wave of 2006, for example. We could actually, put a name to it, and I think that makes it more memorable. Also, we want to be able to compare the heat waves, like how does this, rank versus this other one. And I think that is also very important for prevention, because if you know that like you see hurricane level 4 is coming versus level 1, we know that there might be some evacuation needed. Same thing with a heat wave or a wildfire. If you know that it's going to be a very high level, problematic heat wave or wildfire, we would want to have that information so we can take some preventive before it actually occurs.
Thank you for that, Dr. Basu. Kate, you're next up on my screen. What do you think from a kind of community practitioner standpoint, what the pros and cons of naming a heat wave might be?
Yeah, it would be nice to be able to refer to heat waves retrospectively when talking to community members. I think that one of the things that we sometimes miss about disaster preparedness is that the time to organize people is not necessarily during a crisis, but it's building those relationships ahead of time so that we understand where people are, what their needs are, who they are, and build those long-term relationships so that we're able to respond well. And as someone who is out there doing organizing, chatting with residents on the ground, being able to refer to, heat wave X and get people's experience about it, having a really common language would be great, especially when there's kind of a zillion heat waves that happened. Last year, where I live in Boston, we had, it was close to 20 days above 90 degrees before July 1st. Boston is not known for that kind of weather. We're known for our blizzards more than our heat. So what day am I referring to? What week am I referring to? And being able to anchor residents and get some of those deep memories, because people forget. We once in Pawtucket and Central Falls did some work surveying residents to ask them about their experience of heat, and a lot of folks would say, yeah, it's just hot in the summer. Sometimes it's just hot and muggy. But if you dove a little bit deeper, you would hear from people, I don't get to sit outside on my porch anymore and chat with my neighbors because it's too hot and my heart acts up. Or one of the ones that I think was really interesting was someone who said that they used to walk their dog at their lunch break every day, but now they've had to move their dog's walk to 11 a.m. or to 2 p.m. because otherwise the pavement scalds the dog's paws. So being able to just get into the more humanistic and relationship aspect would be great. And I think naming heat waves would be a great way to connect that for people.
Thank you, Kate. Others, we've got two pro stances. Has anyone really fundamentally or philosophically, push back against that kind of a perspective?
Well, I don't fundamentally, philosophically disagree, but I do think it's important to, at a minimum, play devil's advocate here and point out the many challenges and pitfalls with doing this. I personally am undecided, but lean against naming heat waves. The analogy is often made to storms, and heat waves are not discrete events like storms spatially or in terms of what the exposure is in different locations. And they're also, regional, and you get impacts that are different in different climate zones. How you would name the event in different locations, how you would bound it over time, whether you have to change the name when you've got 2 days in between two events, or is it one continuous event in a region as the temperature, rises and falls slightly. Those are all real technical challenges that lead to communications challenges. And I think that we could end up shooting ourselves in the foot here by creating a lot of issues that right now we don't necessarily have to deal with. And I think that's part of the reason you see a lot of reluctance on the part of our government counterparts who would actually be responsible for implementing a lot of this, where they don't quite see how the technical and governance issues would be worked out. And we can't even, as a community, come together and say what a heat wave is technically now from an epidemiologic standpoint. yet we want to, come up with a definition that works in all environments and a naming convention. I think it's a big challenge. And I think a lot of the things that people refer to as advantages of naming, we can do in other ways. As long as we recognize that heat is dangerous, we don't necessarily have to name the event. The last piece I'll emphasize is, as many people have said here, there actually is quite a bit of risk when heat is not extreme. And so emphasizing extreme events and naming them disregards, it suggests that the rest of the time you're okay. The rest of the time you're not in a hurricane. And that's not really true, particularly for people who are older, people who work outdoors and are highly exposed, et cetera. Their risk is quite high, even outside of these potentially named events. And I think that would discredit that. So.
And that's certainly what we see here locally in Richmond, Virginia, being a hot place. It feels like you're walking around in someone else's breath in the middle of July anyway. So, but it's really the early season April heat wave that comes out of nowhere that isn't even really that intense in relation to the other months that are the most significant in our morbidity data. So, Vivek, or Dr. Chandas, Dr. Mavalankar, the last thoughts on this idea of naming heat waves?
My sense is for Indian subcontinent, I was seeing many days the meteorology service records places which are more than 45 degrees centigrade, which is like 113 degrees Fahrenheit. And there are several hundreds of stations recording those across India. So I don't know, how do we name each station? Will have a different name, or is it a general heat wave and will have similar names? So we need to talk to the weather people and see what is their take on this.
Yeah, and Dr. Chandas, I know your work has focused on how heat waves vary within a city. Like thinking about the background climate versus the one neighborhood would literally have a heat wave for longer than some other neighborhoods.
Yeah, it's interesting because we have, from a strictly data point of view, we have a long history of characterizing heat in terms of satellite imagery, in terms of even measuring on the ground. One of the things that keeps coming up for me is the idea that, when the heat dome affected Pacific Northwest, I was measuring temperatures that were 124 Fahrenheit in one part of town and 99 degrees in another part of town. So while the airport, one reading that we rely on the entire metropolitan region for, was reading 116. So it's really interesting to think about, from a scientific point of view, the level of precision we need in order to be able to move into this naming convention. I do really resonate with the idea of comparing across events like this and kind of being able to epidemiologically get at it. And finally, I might just note that FEMA, one thing I've been trying to kind of bend our Federal Emergency Management Administration, federal agency, they have particular events that they identify as natural hazard. Heat is not one of them currently, and have been on them. And before we get into naming and all the things that might be kind of pluses and minuses of that, and learning from what has worked and not worked for hurricanes for that matter, getting FEMA to recognize heat waves as a natural hazard is a major need for local municipalities then to look at federal agencies for being able to receive funding for preparedness activities or even post-mortem. So I think that's something that we in the US are really thinking about pretty seriously.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Chandas. I think, as I sit here in Richmond, Virginia, which might get rain from Hurricane Ian, but then a few months from now, a nor'easter that remains unnamed. But, we don't, the differentiation among these different hazards and where they rank, and as much as our emergency management agencies, is another underlying conversation that I think is really important to play out. And thank you all for offering your perspectives on that question. I think that's, quite a bit of detail there from each one of your perspectives, and I really value that. One thing that I want to make sure that we get to are a couple of the question and answer requests from the audience. The first one, the top voted question that we're going to ask, and I guess this is more towards Dr. Hess, as I think this came about in your slides, was an audience member asked, I'm curious about the impact of people being, quote, used to hot weather and the impact on their health. People, and Dr. Mavalankar, this is also along with your experience, are people in hotter climates better able to recover from and get through extreme heat? And if so, is this physiological or is this due to behaviors? And so, Dr. Hess, I'll start with you and then pass it over to Dr. Mavalankar.
Sure. So in early on in my slides, I showed two sets of temperature mortality curves, one for people in the northern United States and one for people in the southern United States. And the curve for people in the southern US cities is to the right of the one for people in northern cities. And that's because there are a combination of physiologic and behavioral and built environment adaptations to heat that mean that people in the South are more resilient to extreme heat than people in the North. And we also see this at the beginning of a heat season. People are less acclimatized and probably have different behavioral reflexes than later in the season when they've been dealing with heat for a while. So there certainly is a degree to which physiologic acclimatization occurs. That takes generally about 3 days for most of the physiologic acclimatization to occur, but full acclimatization takes 2 weeks. So, intense early season heat exposure is the most dangerous. Of course, there's a limit to this. These curves look very similar in both places, right? So that tells you that while people in hotter environments are more adapted to a degree, they're still at risk. And the risk increases at the same rate over their minimum mortality temperature as for people who are in colder climates and less acclimatized. In fact, people in colder climates may have even steeper risks up at that high end because they don't have local resources to recruit. So we saw that in our heat dome event in 2021, where a lot of our population doesn't have air conditioning. They don't have real reflexes around extreme heat. And this goes all the way up through the institutions, where our institutions, I was working clinically during that event, and our hospital was strained by the number of patients coming in, but some of our hospitals in other hospitals in our same health system were in crisis. They ran out of beds, they ran out of ventilators. Our EMS service was really strained by the event, and so all of that means that at the upper end of that curve, it gets really steep. The hotter it gets, the more people die. So.
In Dr. Mavalankar, coming from such a place that regularly sees 45 plus temperatures, would you like to offer a bit more perspective on that?
Sure. I think it's just a question of acclimatization. If you look at the Chicago heat wave of 95, European heat wave of 2023, and then the 2010 Indian heat wave in Ahmedabad. In Europe, people died at around 30 to 35 degree temperatures. In Ahmedabad, people start dying at 40 to 45 degrees temperature. So it's almost 10 degree difference. And within India, we have seen there are places hotter than Ahmedabad, like Nagpur, which is in central India. Their thresholds are 1 or 2 degrees higher. So my sense is where overall heat is very high, people are acclimatized to that. And then when it crosses further, goes up, they start having effect. Of course, you have to adjust for moisture. So cities which have moisture, which are on the sea coast, don't reach that high temperature, but mortality even in India rises at 35, 36 degrees in coastal cities. That's why we also need to think of heat index, not only the temperatures.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think so. So, as much as to wrap up this question as clearly as we can, it's complicated by the time of year, the place, the location, closeness to the coast or continentality. But largely, there does seem to be some physiological underprinting of acclimatization that may allow folks that live in warmer or more southerly cities closer to the equator are afforded a bit more resilience to heat wave magnitudes. But ultimately, once you get hot enough, there is no additional capacity, and then that we have to rely on behaviors from there. What last maybe be able to fit in one or two more questions here. But I think we talked about, and I think this was for Dr. Shandas's presentation, was a conversation around how expensive the heat waves are, and especially around the idea of increased crime. So I'm curious if you could start with explaining a bit more about how does heat lead to increased crime, and then if any of the other panelists have additional perspective on their particular context, gladly invite that as well. But Dr. Shandas, please.
Yeah, so I'll quickly caution just that a lot of the studies that are coming out about behavioral responses during shifts in temperature, and especially higher temperature, are correlative studies. They tend to use large, sometimes even small or medium-sized populations to evaluate the relationship between temperature and response. I've seen studies looking at court proceedings, like judiciary court proceedings, in relation to the level of severity of sentencing in relation to temperatures. I've seen a great deal of research on road rage and responses of people who are on roads, and the challenges they have in terms of being able to manage. So a lot of this is physiological. I mean, it's a stress response for us, and I've leaned on the doctors for this a lot more, the medical doctors, to get at that physiological mechanism. But there is a stress response to heat, and it is a lot related to our ability to cope with it. And when our bodies are stressed, as we know from our day-to-day lives, we have responses that are very different than we would do when we weren't stressed. So I think much of what we're seeing in terms of crime and altercations that happen during heat are exacerbated not only by heat, but by several other factors that would be also in play at that same time with those individuals who are participating. So I think in any kind of crime-related events, whether that be physical altercations or other events that have been reported in the literature. So I'll leave it at that and maybe turn it over to others who've been looking at this as well.
Yeah, I'd be curious if Dr. Basu, in your work in California, is that a topic that has come up in your analyses in the epidemiological community, or additional context for answering that question?
Well, we have looked at the question of temperature and mental health, and that's a relatively new field in the epi world. So what we found is that really heat or temperature throughout the whole year in California can lead to greater violence, and also suicides, homicides, and really virtually every mental health outcome that we looked at was increased with hotter temperatures. So that's something to really think about. And again, getting to the underlying mechanisms and like what could be happening. There's some issues with neurotransmitters and how the brain kind of responds to heat and what part of the brain is kind of altered. And one other thing, though, that I'd like to add is to the previous question where we're talking about physiological responses. I do also want to add that a huge disparity is because of lack of resources. So, for example, if there's, I'm just using this as an example, outdoor heat and farm workers. That's an area that hasn't been explored a whole lot, but we're starting to do some more work on that. And I do believe that not everybody has the ability to say, look, it's really hot outside, I can't work today, versus just being able to take days off because they realize that it might be bad for their health. So I think that that's a thing when we're talking about air conditioners too. A lot of times air conditioners are not available in areas that like Northern California that just don't usually have heat waves, but in areas that there are typically heat waves, not everyone can mitigate their exposures as easily. They can't afford the air conditioning. So that's another thing to kind of think about. I know globally, this could be a larger issue, but it's still an issue within California and within the US for sure.
Well, thank you so much for all of these perspectives on these really important questions. I want to make sure that the audience understands that even though there were plenty of questions that we weren't able to get to, we will be trying to offer answers to those on the Keypoint blog. So keep an eye towards that as we're able to answer your questions remotely in text form. But I want to take a second as a quick wrap up to first thank all of the panelists that participated today for offering your expertise and knowledge in this space around heat, health, and inequity. Second of all, thank the Keystone Symposia for putting this on, and to thank all of the audience members from all over the world that joined us today to hear about and learn more about how heat, health, and inequities overlap and intersect not only in our cities but around the world. So thank you very much. And for now, feel free to head over to the live.remo.co link that was in the chat to continue to participate in an optional networking lounge, which happens on this other platform. But thank you again for joining, and we'll look forward to talking to you again sometime in the future. So stay cool out there, everyone, and have a fantastic week ahead.